Yeah, I'm going to talk about using feminist pedagogy to teach EFL or approach EFL language learning. And just for some context, a critically conscious perspective comes from a famous educator named Paulo Freire, who essentially wanted to use education as a means to, or recognize education as a means of reinforcing oppression, but also as liberation. So that's where that comes from, just some context. This is just a quote that I liked a lot. It's called "Culture is the flesh and language is the skeleton of the society." So this is essentially prefacing an issue that I'm going to discuss according to how we teach English, because English is a problematic language and has a problematic history. So here are some contemporary issues teaching EFL or ESL. Just fun fact, EFL is for countries like China, Japan, essentially countries that haven't been colonized, and ESL is for countries that have been colonized and were forced to use English as a means of communication. But anyways, so contemporary issues, people have argued that English essentially has maintained structural and cultural inequalities while reinforcing this idea of global hegemony. So it's, creating this false image of this is how you should be if you want to succeed and contribute to the world in an academic or economic sense. It affects the formation of people's views of their own language, culture, race, ethnicity, and identity. And specifically in a Japanese context, because this is coming out Japan, I can save this tangent for other countries too. But the Japanese have adopted the English speakers' view of the world, or tend to. This is a generalization. So they essentially are internalizing Anglo-Saxon views, and their identity becomes split as a result of English, because you have Japanese people who are seeking to identify with Westerners while simultaneously othering Asian people or themselves, or friends, family, their culture, etc. And despite the fact that culture is a well-known part of learning a language, most teachers never receive formal training on how to teach culture or how to increase their students' awareness of culture. And then there's also just a smaller component. There's a lot of gendered discourse that's closely linked to English, which has the potential to influence learners and their investments and decisions. So in language learning, there's this idea of enculturation versus aculturation. Enculturation is the assimilation of the learner into the host culture. So you're completely subsuming the learner and you don't care about their culture. You're just like, come to our side, learn our culture. That's the best one. And there's kind of this connotation of superiority. Aculturation is the process by which the learner is encouraged to function within the new culture while maintaining their own culture. So I would argue that EFL teachers should strive for acculturation instead of enculturation, which I think we tend to, unfortunately, focus on the former instead of the latter. So just for some background information, these are some traditional learning methods in Japan. Typically, Japanese students learn via rote methods or Confucius style. So this leaves students little to no chance to reflect on the meaning or the purpose of English. They value indirect speech, not challenging peers or teachers, conforming to keep the group harmony. And then the average Japanese student is pressured to pay extreme attention to the grammar, often at the expense of meaning. They're just kind of internalizing, or they're not really internalizing English as a language. They're just taking it at face value and memorizing it in order to regurgitate the information. Another interesting component of traditional learning methods in Japan, which I thought was really interesting, is this notion of silence. So Westerners often interpret silence in this context as either disinterested, bored, or lazy, but silence in the Japanese context is pretty culturally salient and highly valued. So these are the 4 principles of silence. You have silence as truthfulness, silence as embarrassment, silence as defiance, and silence as social discretion, like I had mentioned prior, for the sake of maintaining this harmony within a group. So the reason I'm talking about feminist pedagogy in relation to EFL and Japanese language learning styles is that we shouldn't assume that lack of silence equals a lack of a voice, but rather question what is underneath that silence. So this is where the role of culture comes in. Culture basically can fill these gaps of, internal conflict and tension and questions by giving students a context in which they can express themselves. And an awareness of culture can essentially facilitate this transformation of the Japanese cultural identity into a more globally conscious one, not just conforming to global hegemony, but emphasis on globally conscious. So I might butcher this pronunciation, but there are 2 parts of culture called, one of them is tatame, which is principles in public face. So that's the importance of maintaining this in public situations. And then there's hone, which are your true private thoughts and feelings, which is essentially important to express at home to the people that you share intimacy with in social territory. And so taking these elements of Japanese culture, I think teachers should strive to form a more intimate domain within their classroom, aka hone. So Japanese people typically become more relaxed when they're released from cultural and institutional restraints. So this is where feminism comes in. Feminist pedagogy, most famously discussed by Bell Hooks, who's an academic and author, professor, queen. Basically, there's feminist post-structuralism emphasizes the intrinsic links between gender and other social identities, more commonly known as intersectionality nowadays. Key elements include voice, empowerment, safety, conscious raising, community, power, and that's not limited to those, but those are kind of the main parts of feminist pedagogy. So basically what it is aiming to do is understand the relationship between power and knowledge and know that this is all subjective. It's not objective at all. So basically, it theorizes the role of language in the production of power, aka English, and deconstructs master narratives which oppress certain groups. So what feminist pedagogy would do in an EFL context is this very act of questioning how English produces power relations and hierarchies and dynamics, and then deconstructing that. But also, it would be biased of me to just assume that English is a horrible language and shouldn't be taught anywhere, because there are some benefits to English. So these are some primary motivations for female EFL learners. A lot of female EFL learners think that English is linked to feminism and basically can serve as a means of economic liberation from patriarchal constraints. So, getting you a job, therefore you don't have to rely on your spouse or father, so forth. And then this one was interesting to me. It's a study found that Japanese female learners thought that English is better suited to express their emotions. So those are some benefits of learning English for female EFL learners, which basically leads me to the last slide of my presentation, which are potential solutions and lesson plan ideas. So one possible solution is reflexive activities, teacher-led discussions, personal storytelling, journal writing, etc. Writing about a time when a student felt culturally awkward, or describing situations that challenge cultural stereotypes. Choosing a proverb from a list of various countries, not one's own country, and then writing an expository paragraph about it. Theme-based learning, so sexual harassment, domestic violence, sexism, sexuality. There are a lot of grassroots feminist English programs in Japan, actually, that use a lot of theme-based learning to cover topics like this. And then desexing language, so instead of saying salesman, say salesperson. And then also just kind of creating this shared leadership in the classroom to build a community, letting everyone know that their voice matters, their opinion is, it's valuable. You're creating a safe space where everyone feels like they can kind of express their concerns and ideas. Oh yeah, and then this is just a little side note, just kind of underpinning these solutions and lesson plans is the fact that EFL educators should include readings and discussions on women issues and make women visible within the classroom, as well as avoiding gender stereotypes and false generics. So you don't necessarily have to be teaching about gender-related issues or feminism directly to include feminist pedagogy, is my point. But yeah, so that's it. If anyone has any thoughts or ideas or other potential solutions they want to share, I'd love to hear them. Yeah, thank you.
Again, another great presentation. Thank you so much. That was super interesting and never thought about most of that before. So really, really good introduction. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions for Kelly?
I'll make my little comments here too. I just want to say it's really, really interesting. I was writing down a lot of your ideas too of activity, like the slide with the reflexive and so on. And then I thought, why am I writing this down? I'll just ask for the slides. But
yeah, I can send it to you, Matt.
So please, but no, I thought it was really cool. A couple things that surprised me, and maybe this is kind of a sign, kind of a tribute to what you're talking about. Who was that? Gwen Lexa had the book about teaching culture, right? In her presentation, and we were talking about it a bit. But those two terms, enculturation and Aculturation, I had never heard before, and I kind of felt embarrassed, going through a master's teaching program. Lexa brought up this book that was great that I did get recommended before, but those two terms I never even heard of, and I felt like, is this a bigger issue that I should have had a class on this in my teaching, and also embarrassed because I'm being involved in international education for so long, but I just thought that was really cool. I learned a lot. And the 4 principles of silence, I hadn't heard that either. And for those of you guys who've done English camp, you probably were totally relating to that. And Kelly, we got to add that to the training.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I want to say, so far, as always, your guys' PowerPoints always look so nice. It's I got to learn how to do that.
I just get mine off of some random pre-made website. I don't know if you guys do that too.
Well, I guess I need to know those. Anyways, thanks. And yeah, thanks again. Good presentation.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh yeah, sharing them. And yeah, Laurelyn, I just started realizing Canva. Kelly, the class you did with me on Saturday, how was Canva? And you're like, oh, Canva slides? And I was like, I know, right? I don't know.
I guess.
So this is totally random, but actually a lot of things in your presentation are actually tested on the MCAT.
Oh, really?
What?
Wait, what specifically?
A lot of things about feminism and the idea that you were alluding to about how like you have different selves in different situations, it's actually really big in psychology. It's called backstage and front stage self. And a lot of like what you go over as well is like there's a hierarchy of salience where you let the situation dictate your personality.
Well, that's
So
really
my
cool.
MCAT soon, so I know way too much about this stuff.
Well, I didn't. That's really cool. Also, good luck on the MCAT.
I never would have guessed that. That's amazing that it kind of all comes together and connects in different disciplines. And I know this wasn't, I have a small question. I know this wasn't like the main point of the presentation, but the thing you said that was really interesting about Japanese women thinking that it's easier to express their thoughts and ideas in English rather than Japanese. I was wondering if there was like a little more background to that, or it kind of went into more detail, because I just thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, I don't, well, so it's actually, I was really confused because have you guys ever read Murakami or any Japanese authors like that? I find, or even when if you're watching anime and you see the subtitle, the subtitles and the direct translations, it's very concise and condensed and like, I feel like very straightforward. Christine, you're breaking my heart. I love Murakami. But it's interesting because I kind of just assumed that that was like the Japanese language. It was this very concise and condensed and straightforward. And I actually wrote a paper on this for one of my classes. But apparently, like, Japanese language has been described as being like emotional and all over